Welcome to This Explainer. Today, we're embarking on a truly profound spiritual journey through Job chapters 24 to 28. It's an incredibly rich section of scripture taking us from the very depths of earthly despair straight to the majestic summit of divine wisdom. If you've ever wrestled with the seemingly unfair realities of our fallen world, the passages we're looking at today hold some of the most raw, honest, and ultimately beautiful theological truths you'll find anywhere in scripture. So, let's get right into it. Here's our roadmap for this explainer. We'll methodically trace Job's path through 5 key stages. First, God's silence in Job chapter 24. Then, Bildad's attack in chapter 25. The majesty of infinite creation in chapter 26. An unwavering conscience in chapter 27. And finally, true wisdom in Job chapter 28. Let's begin with Job chapter 24. God's silence. Up until this point, Job has really been crying out about his own personal suffering. But right here, the lens widens. He shifts his gaze to the glaring, heartbreaking injustices of the fallen world around him, and he wrestles with this crushing spiritual dilemma. Just look at his question from Job chapter 24, verse 1. He's essentially asking, why doesn't God establish a clear schedule for justice? Job is just agonizing over why the righteous can't actually see the wicked judged in real time. It's that classic problem, right? Why isn't justice realized immediately in a world governed by a perfectly righteous God?
Well, notice how incredibly specific Job gets when cataloging the corruption around him. He points out people literally moving boundary stones to steal land, or forcibly snatching the last remaining donkeys and oxen from orphans and widows. Just imagine the scene he paints in verses 10 and 11. You have these poor, exploited laborers spending all day treading wine presses and making oil, yet they themselves are starving and dying of thirst. Meanwhile, the murderers, thieves, and adulterers who use the darkness to hide seem to just thrive. It looks like the wicked live long under providence, passing away peacefully in their old age like fully ripe grain. It just doesn't make sense to him.
And that brings us to Job chapter 24, verse 12, a verse that perfectly encapsulates Job's deepest agony. The innocent are groaning and dying, yet there seems to be this agonizing silence from God. Now, the absolutely crucial point here is that Job isn't turning away from God. Actually, scratch that idea entirely. This is not a lack of faith at all. It's a raw, completely honest wrestling match. Job is bringing the brutal reality of a fallen world directly to God, desperately asking why things have to be this way. This brings us to Job chapter 25, Bildad's attack. Now, this chapter is actually the shortest in the entire book, just 6 verses, which really signals that Job's friends are running completely out of arguments. Bildad simply cannot answer Job's valid complaints about the world's injustice. So instead, he launches a final, desperate attack, trying to weaponize the majesty of God just to crush Job. Bildad speaks of God's immense sovereignty, sure, but then he ends his argument in Job chapter 25, verse 6 with this frankly shocking theological misapplication. He calls a suffering, grieving human being a maggot and a worm. He completely strips away human dignity just trying to force Job into silence. So the big takeaway here is the stark contrast between these two perspectives. On one hand, you've got Bildad's harsh legalism, which basically boils down to, God is great, therefore you are a worthless worm, so be quiet. But true theology doesn't trample on the suffering. As we're going to see, Job's theology is about reverent awe, an awe that elevates God without maliciously crushing the human spirit.
Which leads us beautifully into Job chapter 26, Infinite Creation. As we get into chapter 26, Job sharply dismisses his friend's empty help, essentially telling Bildad, you've been absolutely no help to me whatsoever. And dismissing them, Job begins this majestic, awe-inspiring hymn to the Creator that completely outshines Bildad's shallow theology. With stunning insight into creation, Job declares in verse 7 that God hangs the earth on nothing. Think about that. Thousands of years ago, Job intuitively understood that the earth is suspended in the void solely by God's sustaining hand. He goes on to describe how God perfectly controls the waters, keeps the heavy clouds from bursting, and commands the boundaries of light and darkness. Even the deepest realms of death, Sheol itself, are completely exposed before him.
And this right here brilliantly illustrates Job's profound reverence. In Job chapter 26, verse 14, he looks at the unfathomable majesty of the visible world, the skies, the earth, the oceans, and he calls them merely the outer fringe of God's works. The totality of human knowledge is just a faint whisper of his actual capability. Job asks, if all of this is just a whisper, Who could possibly withstand the full thunder of his power? That, my friends, is true awe and true humility before the Creator.
Let's move on to Job chapter 27, Unwavering Conscience.
The debate with his friends essentially ends right here, and Job takes a solemn, deeply spiritual oath to defend his integrity. He knows his friends have completely failed to understand God's plan, and he absolutely refuses to give in to their false accusations. Look closely at the profound paradox in Job chapter 27, verse 2. Even in his intense bitterness, feeling as though God has denied him justice, Job faithfully anchors his oath directly in the living God. He doesn't swear by his own power. He doesn't swear by some other deity. Even in his absolute deepest pain, he acknowledges the Almighty as the singular, supreme authority over his life and soul.
Job absolutely refuses to confess to false sins just to appease his friends. Job chapter 27, verses 5 and 6 stand as this incredible declaration of a fiercely unwavering conscience before his Creator. He's basically saying, look, I may have lost everything, I may be mocked and suffering, but I will not let go of my spiritual integrity. It's just an incredible display of faith-driven courage.
And now we reach the summit of our explainer. Job chapter 28, True Wisdom. After all the fierce debates and agonizing questions, the tone shifts here into a beautiful, deeply reflective search for ultimate truth. Job uses a brilliant metaphor. Starting around verse 3, he describes the astonishing capabilities of human beings. I mean, we go to exhausting lengths, don't we? Tunneling through absolute darkness, carving shafts through solid rock, literally moving massive mountains at the roots, all just to extract physical wealth, like gold and precious gems from the earth. Humans are brilliant at uncovering hidden physical treasures. Yet despite all of these monumental technical achievements, we cannot unearth spiritual understanding on our own.
So Job asks the ultimate question in Job chapter 28, verse 20. Where then does wisdom actually come from? Where does understanding dwell? Since no amount of pure gold, silver, or precious onyx can buy it, and since even death and destruction have only heard vague rumors of it, where is true life-giving wisdom actually found?
Well, the answer is magnificent. Job chapter 28, verses 23 and 24 declare that only God understands the way to it. The one who established the weight of the wind, the measure of the waters, and the laws of the rain holds the absolute key to this ultimate truth. Only the Creator, whose providence oversees the ends of the earth and sees everything under the heavens, possesses true wisdom.
And this brilliantly illustrates the core revelation of our entire journey today. Job chapter 28, verse 28 gives us the definitive answer. God spoke to humanity and said, "The fear of the Lord, that is wisdom, and to shun evil is understanding." True wisdom isn't about having the intellectual capacity to perfectly understand every tiny detail of God's plan. It's definitely not about winning a theological debate. True wisdom is a posture of the heart. It's about reverencing the Lord, submitting to His sovereignty even when we don't understand our circumstances, and intentionally turning away from evil in our daily lives. As we wrap up this explainer, I want to leave you with a final provocative thought to carry with you into your own spiritual journey. We all face moments where the world feels wildly unjust and God feels silent. In those moments, will you demand a complete explanation of God's plan, or will you choose the path of true wisdom? Will you choose to reverence and trust the Creator whose mere whisper is enough to hold the entire earth in place? Thank you so much for joining me on this profound journey through Job. Keep seeking, keep trusting, and I'll see you in the next explainer.